Unaware she is daughter of a secret trillionaire who died few months ago, a wife stood frozen as her husband and family laughed while his mistress poured dirty water on her at a Christmas party. But none of them knew she had just inherited the 10B real estate company they worked for. The humiliation dripped down her designer dress, a gift from a father she never knew existed. But the envelope in her purse contained documents that would transform this moment of degradation into their ultimate destruction. Her husband's mistress smirked with champagne-flushed confidence, but that same woman had unknowingly just drenched her own future employer and judge. The family who had tormented her for years roared with approval, but their paychecks, their mortgages, their very livelihoods hung on the decision she would make in 72 hours. What would she do when the lawyers revealed her identity at Monday's emergency board meeting? How would her husband react when he discovered the worthless wife he betrayed now controlled his career? Could the mistress who humiliated her survive what was coming, and would the family who laughed ever smile again? The crystal chandelier above cast fractured light across the ballroom of Northridge Tower's penthouse venue, but Elena Morrison saw none of its beauty as freezing water soaked through her dress and into her skin. The Denver skyline glittered through floor-to-ceiling windows behind her, but all she could focus on was the bucket in Vanessa Cole's perfectly manicured hands and the cruel satisfaction spreading across her husband's face. "Oops," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with mock innocence that matched the water now pooling at Elena's feet. "I'm so clumsy tonight." The laughter erupted immediately, but it wasn't the surprised gasp of witnesses to an accident. It was the calculated cruelty of people who had waited for this moment. Elena's husband Derek stood beside Vanessa, his arms sliding possessively around the other woman's waist, but his eyes remained locked on Elena, with an expression she'd seen countless times, contempt mixed with triumph. "Jesus, Elena," Derek said, shaking his head in theatrical disappointment. "You can't even stand at a Christmas party without making a scene." The family closed in like sharks, sensing blood, but Elena recognized each face as belonging to someone who had spent 7 years reminding her she didn't belong. Derek's mother, Patricia Morrison, clutched her champagne glass with white knuckles, but her smile was genuine for the first time in years. "This is what happens when you let someone from her background into society events," Patricia announced to the gathered crowd. "No grace, no dignity, just constant embarrassment." Derek's brother Cameron whistled low, but his words cut deeper than the water's cold. "Man, Derek, I told you that charity case you married would never fit into our world. Look at her, standing there like a drowned rat at the company Christmas party." The company, Northridge Properties. The name blazed across Elena's consciousness, but she forced herself to remain still, to let the humiliation wash over her the same way the dirty water had. The bucket had contained more than just water. She could smell the mop solution, could see the gray tinge that suggested it had come from a janitor's closet, but that detail seemed intentional rather than accidental. Vanessa stepped closer, her Louboutin heels clicking against marble that cost more per square foot than Elena's childhood home, but her voice dropped to a whisper only Elena could hear. "You should have left when Derek asked you to. Now everyone sees what you really are, nothing." The crowd had grown, but Elena recognized most of them as Northridge Properties employees, people who had attended this mandatory Christmas party at the company's crown jewel property. Senior executives mingled with department heads, but all of them had stopped their conversations to witness her humiliation. Some looked away uncomfortably, but most wore expressions ranging from amusement to satisfaction. "Someone get her a towel," a voice called out, dripping with false concern. "Can't have the cleaning lady catching cold." More laughter rippled through the crowd, but Elena's hand instinctively moved to her purse, feeling the envelope inside through the wet fabric. The envelope that had arrived 3 months ago, delivered by a law firm she'd never heard of. containing information that had shattered everything she thought she knew about herself. 3 months ago, but it felt like 3 lifetimes. Flashback. 3 months earlier, Elena had been sorting mail in the tiny apartment she still maintained separately from Derek's upscale condo, a safety net he'd mocked her for keeping, when the certified letter arrived. The return address showed Whitmore and Associates, estate attorneys, but she'd assumed it was a mistake, perhaps meant for another Elena Morrison in the Denver metro area. The letter inside had been brief but devastating. Dear Ms. Morrison, we regret to inform you of the passing of Mr. Robert Whitmore Chen, who has been identified as your biological father. Please contact our office immediately regarding matters of inheritance and estate settlement. Robert Whitmore Chen. The name meant nothing to her then, but a quick internet search had made her hands shake so violently she'd dropped her phone. Robert Whitmore Chen, reclusive billionaire, founder and CEO of Northridge Properties, one of the largest real estate conglomerates in North America, but also one of the most private men in American business. Articles described his secretive nature, his refusal to be photographed, his insistence on operating through proxies and intermediaries, but nowhere in any article was there mention of a daughter. Elena's mother had died when she was 6, but she'd taken the secret of Elena's father to her grave. Elena had grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes, but she'd never imagined her father was alive, much less watching her from a distance. The meeting with the attorneys had been surreal, but the DNA test they'd insisted upon had confirmed what the letter claimed. Robert Chen had known about her existence but had never made contact, choosing instead to observe her life from afar. But his will made his reasoning clear in a handwritten letter the attorneys had provided. Elena, the letter began in shaky handwriting. I am a coward. I watched you struggle through foster care, watched you put yourself through community college, watched you marry a man who doesn't deserve you, but I never had the courage to enter your life and disrupt what you'd built. My empire was built on secrets and shadows, but those same shadows kept me from the one person who mattered. By the time you read this, I'll be gone, but everything I built is yours. Use it wisely. Use it to become the person I never had the courage to be. Show the world what a Chen can do when they choose light over shadows. Your father, Robert. The inheritance had been beyond comprehension, but the structure was complex. She would inherit everything, 100% ownership of Northridge Properties, worth approximately $10 billion, plus personal assets, but there were conditions. She had to maintain absolute secrecy for 90 days, while the legal transition occurred, allowing the company's board and executives to continue operating normally, but on the 91st day, her identity would be revealed at a mandatory board meeting. The attorneys had explained that Robert Chen had wanted to see how the company operated without his presence, but he'd also wanted to give Elena time to observe the business and the people who ran it before they knew who she was. It was a test, but also a gift, the chance to see people's true nature before they put on masks. Today was day 88. Present, the Christmas party. Elena stood in her soaking dress, but the memory of that letter burned hotter than her embarrassment. Derek worked for Northridge Properties as a senior acquisitions director, but he'd gotten the job before they'd married, back when he'd actually loved her, or at least back when he'd been convincing enough in his performance of love. His family had positions throughout the company, Patricia in corporate relations, Cameron in development, but they'd all made it clear Elena was beneath them. Vanessa Cole was Derek's assistant, but everyone knew their relationship had progressed far beyond professional boundaries. Elena had known for 6 months, had found the texts and emails, but Derek had laughed when she'd confronted him. What are you going to do, Elena? He'd sneered. Divorce me? You'd get nothing. You signed that prenup, remember? The one my lawyers wrote that gives you exactly $0 if you're the one who files. You'd be back to living in some studio apartment, probably cleaning houses again. He'd been right about the prenup, but he'd been catastrophically wrong about everything else. "Are you just going to stand there all night?" Patricia's voice cut through Elena's memories. "Good Lord, girl, at least have the dignity to leave. You're embarrassing my son." Elena finally moved, but instead of fleeing as they expected, she walked calmly toward the bathroom hallway. The crowd parted for her, but their whispers followed like gnats. She could feel Derek's satisfaction, could sense Vanessa's triumph, but she kept her expression neutral, almost blank. In the bathroom, she locked the door and pulled out her phone, but her hands remained steady as she dialed the number she'd been given for emergencies. Ms. Morrison, Robert Chen's former executive assistant, now her executive assistant, answered on the first ring. "Is everything all right?" "Grace," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying none of the emotion churning inside her. "I need you to move up the timeline. Monday's board meeting, I want it tomorrow. Saturday morning, 10 a.m., mandatory attendance for all executives and board members." There was a pause, but Grace's voice carried approval when she responded. "That's Christmas Day weekend. People will be angry about being called in." "Good," Elena said simply. "And Grace, I want security footage from tonight's party. All angles, but particularly the footage showing the incident that just occurred." "Already pulling it, Ms. Morrison. The building's security system reports directly to the owner, and has for the past 90 days. I've been watching everything." Elena felt something shift inside her chest, but it wasn't sadness or fear, it was something colder, sharper. "Send invitations to Derek Morrison's family as well. Patricia, Cameron, and Derek's father, Richard. They're not executives, but I want them present." "Consider it done. And, Ms. Morrison, if I may speak freely, it's about damn time." Elena ended the call and stared at herself in the mirror, but the woman looking back seemed different than the person who'd entered the ballroom an hour ago. Her dress was ruined, her hair plastered to her skull, but her eyes held something new. Purpose. She thought about the 90 days she'd spent in silence, watching Derek's increasing boldness with Vanessa, watching his family's casual cruelty, but also watching the company her father had built. She'd used false credentials to tour properties, had posed as a prospective client to observe how deals were conducted, but what she'd discovered had been disturbing. Derek's acquisition department was systematically overpaying for properties, but the sellers were shell companies that traced back to offshore accounts. Cameron's development projects were coming in millions over budget, but the contractors receiving those inflated payments shared board members with companies the Morrison family had connections to. Patricia's corporate relations department had been burying complaints about discrimination and harassment, but the pattern suggested a culture of protecting certain people while sacrificing others. The company was being bled from the inside, but the Morrisons had been careful to avoid obvious illegality. It was sophisticated theft, death by 1,000 cuts, but Elena had documentation of all of it, thanks to Grace's quiet investigation. Her father's letter had asked her to choose light over shadows, but Elena wondered if he'd understood what that really meant. The light revealed everything, both the truth and the ugliness people tried to hide. Flashback. 7 years earlier, Elena had met Derek at a charity fundraiser where she'd been working as catering staff, but he'd approached her with a smile that had seemed genuine. He'd been different then, or perhaps he'd simply been better at hiding his true nature. But Elena had been 23 and naive enough to believe in fairy tales. "You're not like the other people here," Derek had said, leaning against the bar where Elena was restocking wine glasses. "Everyone else is so fake, so concerned with appearances." "Maybe I'm just good at hiding it," Elena had replied. But her smile had been genuine. They'd dated for 6 months before Derek proposed, but the wedding had been when the mask started slipping. His family had made their disapproval clear. Elena had no pedigree, no money, no connections. But Derek had assured her they'd come around. They never had. The first year of marriage had been tolerable, but Derek's behavior had shifted once he'd secured his promotion at Northridge Properties. The man who'd claimed to love her despite her background had started using that background as a weapon, reminding her constantly that she'd been lucky he'd rescued her from poverty, but his words had grown sharper with each passing year. "You should be grateful," he'd said one night after she'd questioned his late nights at the office. "Do you know how many men would have married someone with your history? Foster care, community college, working as a maid? I gave you a life, Elena." But the life he'd given her had been a cage, beautiful and gilded, but still a cage. The affair with Vanessa had started a year ago, but Derek had barely tried to hide it. He'd brought her to company events, had introduced her to his family, but everyone had treated it as an open secret that Elena was simply too pathetic to acknowledge. "Why don't you just leave?" Patricia had asked her once, the question loaded with hope rather than concern. "Surely you can see you don't belong in this world." Elena had stayed for reasons she'd questioned every day, but now she understood. Some part of her, perhaps the part that carried Robert Chen's DNA, had known that leaving would have been the easy path, but the right path required walking through fire first. Present, the bathroom. Elena dried herself as much as possible with paper towels, but the dress was beyond salvaging. She pulled her hair back into a tight ponytail, but she made no effort to fix her makeup or restore her appearance to its previous state. If anything, she wanted to return to that ballroom looking exactly as they'd left her, beaten, humiliated, destroyed, because the contrast tomorrow would be that much sweeter. She returned to the party, but the energy had shifted slightly. Some people had returned to their conversations, satisfied that the entertainment was over, but Derek and Vanessa held court near the bar, surrounded by Morrison family members and their closest allies. "I honestly don't know why she even came tonight," Vanessa was saying, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Derek's been clear about wanting a divorce for months." "Prenup makes it complicated," Cameron replied with a shrug. "If she files, she gets nothing. If Derek files, he has to pay her something. Cheaper to just make her miserable until she leaves on her own." Patricia laughed, but the sound was sharp and cruel. The gold digger thought she'd hit the jackpot marrying Derek. Little did she know the prenup meant she was essentially a volunteer. Derek raised his glass in a mock toast. "To strategic planning. Sometimes you have to invest a little in the beginning to save millions in the end." Elena positioned herself near a column where she could hear but remain mostly unseen, but her phone was recording every word. Not that she'd need the recording. Grace had assured her that the entire venue was wired for sound, a security measure Robert Chen had insisted upon for all Northridge properties, but Elena wanted her own copy. "So what's the timeline?" Richard Morrison, Derek's father and a silent partner in several of the suspicious deals Elena had uncovered, asked his son. "When are you pulling the trigger?" "After the holidays," Derek replied. "I'll file in January, claim irreconcilable differences. The prenup limits her payout to $50,000 if I'm the one who files, but I'll probably offer her $75,000 just to avoid a fight. She'll take it. Where else is she going to get money like that?" $75,000. Elena almost laughed, but the sound would have drawn attention. Derek was planning to pay her $75,000 to end a 7-year marriage, but he had no idea she now controlled his $850,000 annual salary and every benefit that came with it. "What about Vanessa?" Patricia asked. "Are you sure about making this move?" Derek pulled Vanessa closer, but his kiss was performative, designed to be seen. "Mom, I've never been more sure about anything. Vanessa fits into our world. She understands business, understands ambition. She's not some charity project who needs constant management. Plus," Vanessa added with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I can actually help Derek's career instead of dragging it down. My father's connections in the development world are going to open doors for him that Elena never could." Elena filed that information away, Vanessa's father was Thomas Cole, a commercial real estate developer who'd been bidding on several major Northridge contracts, but his bids had been consistently rejected for the past 5 years due to quality concerns. Suddenly, Derek's relationship with Vanessa made more sense, but it also added another layer to the corruption she'd uncovered. "The company's changing," Cameron said, lowering his voice slightly. "Old man Chen is dead, and there's some mystery heir supposedly taking over, but whoever it is has been completely hands-off. No one's even met them. That kind of absentee ownership is perfect for people who know how to operate in the shadows." "Is the heir even real?" Patricia asked. "I've heard rumors it's just a trust structure, that the company's effectively being run by the board now." Richard Morrison smiled, but the expression was predatory. "Real or not, the new ownership structure has been very good for those of us who know how to work the system. Chen used to audit everything personally, but now there's no oversight beyond the standard board reviews, and we all know how thorough those are." He winked, and the group laughed, but Elena felt her hands curl into fists. They were openly discussing their theft, confident that no one was watching, but they'd forgotten the fundamental truth about shadows. They only exist where there's light to cast them. Flashback. Elena's investigation. Over the past 90 days, Elena had lived a double life, but the experience had transformed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. By day, she'd played the role of Derek's increasingly invisible wife, but by night, she'd studied financial reports, property records, and corporate documents with an intensity that would have shocked anyone who knew her. Grace had been instrumental, but she'd also been cautious. "Ms. Morrison," she'd said during one of their early meetings, "your father spent 40 years building this company. What we're finding suggests a significant portion of that value has been siphoned away over the past 7 years. The timing coincides with your husband's employment." Elena had studied the spreadsheets Grace provided, but the numbers told a damning story. Properties purchased for 15–20% above market value, but always with justifications that seemed reasonable in isolation. Development projects that somehow always needed emergency funding, but the emergencies were never quite emergencies when examined closely. Corporate relations expenses that included lavish client entertainment spending, but the clients being entertained were often connected to Morrison family interests. "How much?" Elena had asked. "Total, how much have they taken?" Grace had hesitated, but her answer had been devastating. Conservative estimate, $300 million over 7 years, but the impact on company valuation is much larger, probably close to $1 billion when you factor in lost opportunities and reputation damage. Oh, $1 billion. Elena had struggled to comprehend the scale, but Grace had shown her property by property, deal by deal, how the theft had been accomplished. It was sophisticated, requiring cooperation across multiple departments, but the Morrison family had strategically positioned themselves to make it possible. "Your father knew something was wrong," Grace had continued. "The last year of his life, he was investigating, pulling reports, but his illness progressed faster than his investigation. That's why he structured your inheritance the way he did. He wanted you to see it for yourself, to understand the full scope before you took action." Elena had realized then that her father's 90-day observation period had been about more than just watching the company, but it had been about watching her marriage, her in-laws, the people who'd spent years convincing her she was worthless. He'd given her time to see the truth without the rose-colored glasses of hope or love obscuring her vision. "What would my father have done?" Elena had asked. Grace had smiled sadly. "Your father believed in second chances, but he also believed that some people revealed themselves so completely that second chances became enabling rather than kindness. He would have let the evidence speak for itself." Present, leaving the party. Elena slipped out of the Christmas party without saying goodbye, but she doubted anyone noticed or cared. The cold Denver air hit her wet dress immediately, but the doorman flagged her a taxi without commenting on her appearance. The professional courtesy suggested he'd seen worse, but Elena appreciated his discretion. In the taxi, she texted Grace, "Everyone confirmed for tomorrow." The response came instantly. All executives, all board members, and the Morrison family. Several people have complained about the timing, but legal has confirmed attendance is mandatory per their employment contracts. Security will be present. Elena leaned back against the seat, but her mind was already racing through tomorrow's possibilities. She'd spent 90 days planning this moment, but she'd also spent 7 years living with the consequences of trusting the wrong people. The combination had forged something new inside her, but she wasn't entirely sure she recognized the person she was becoming. Was this justice or revenge? Was there a difference? Her phone buzzed with a message from Derek. "Don't bother coming home tonight. Vanessa's staying over. Maybe stay at a hotel or something." Elena stared at the message, but she felt nothing. No pain, no anger, just a distant observation that Derek had chosen, the night before the board meeting, to make his cruelest gesture yet. It was almost poetic, but the poetry was accidental rather than intentional. She replied, "Okay." One word, but it contained multitudes he couldn't begin to comprehend. The board meeting, Saturday 10 a.m. The Northridge Properties boardroom occupied the entire top floor of the company's headquarters building, but the 360-degree views of Denver and the Rocky Mountains beyond had been designed to intimidate as much as impress. Robert Chen had believed that important decisions should be made in rooms that reminded people how small they were, but also how much possibility existed in the world. Elena arrived at 9:45 a.m., but she used a private elevator that opened directly into the executive office suite. Grace met her there, but the older woman's expression was unreadable. "They're all here," Grace said quietly, "and they're furious. Christmas weekend, mandatory attendance, no explanation. It's unprecedented in company history." "Good," Elena replied, but she was checking her reflection in the glass wall. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a black pantsuit that was both professional and severe, but she'd paired it with her mother's simple cross necklace, the only possession she'd kept from her childhood. The combination felt right, power tempered with memory. "The Morrison family is particularly vocal," Grace continued. "Derek's been demanding to know who called this meeting, but legal is stonewalling him." "Where's the video from last night?" "Queued up and ready. I've also prepared the financial reports, the forensic analysis, and the legal recommendations. Ms. Morrison, are you absolutely certain you want to do this publicly? We could handle this quietly through legal channels and private settlements." Elena met Grace's eyes, but her voice was steady. "My father spent his life in shadows, and look where it got him. Successful, wealthy, powerful, but alone. He asked me to choose light. That means bringing everything into the open, doesn't it?" Grace smiled then, but the expression was fierce. "Your father would have been proud of you. Terrified, but proud." At 9:58 a.m., Elena walked into the boardroom, but she entered through the main doors rather than the executive entrance. The effect was immediate. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, but the confusion on faces was palpable. The room held 30 people, but Elena recognized most of them from the party last night. Derek sat near the middle of the table, Vanessa beside him, but his expression shifted from confusion to something darker when he saw Elena. Patricia, Cameron, and Richard Morrison occupied seats near Derek, but their body language suggested they'd been orchestrating something before Elena's arrival. "What the hell is she doing here?" Derek demanded, addressing the room rather than Elena. "This is a board meeting. She's not an employee." "Actually," Grace said, entering behind Elena, "she's the reason you're all here. May I introduce Elena Morrison, sole owner and CEO of Northridge Properties, daughter of the late Robert Whitmore Chen." The silence that followed was absolute, but Elena watched as comprehension moved across faces at different speeds. Some people understood immediately, but others required several seconds to process the impossible claim. Derek stood so abruptly his chair fell backward. "That's insane. Grace, what kind of joke is this?" "No joke, Mr. Morrison," Grace replied calmly. She placed a document in front of each person at the table. "These are certified copies of the inheritance documents, the DNA confirmation, and the legal transfer of ownership. Ms. Morrison has been the sole owner of this company for 90 days, but per the terms of Mr. Chen's will, her identity remained confidential during a transition observation period. That period ended yesterday." Elena watched Derek's face cycle through emotions, disbelief, shock, horror, but settling finally on a kind of desperate calculation. She could see him trying to figure out how to spin this, how to salvage the situation, but the mathematics of his position were unchangeable. "Elena," he said, and his voice carried a warmth it hadn't held in years. "Elena, honey, this is incredible news. Why didn't you tell me? We should have been celebrating, not—" He paused, clearly remembering the party. "Last night was just a misunderstanding, you know that. Vanessa didn't mean anything by it. It was just—" "A bucket of dirty water poured over my head while you laughed?" Elena interrupted, her voice calm but carrying clearly through the room. "That kind of misunderstanding?" "It was a joke gone wrong," Derek insisted, but his eyes were desperate. "Come on, Elena, you know me. You know I'd never intentionally hurt you." "Actually," Elena replied, "I do know you, Derek. That's the problem." She nodded to Grace, who dimmed the lights and started the video, but the screen at the head of the table blazed to life with footage from the Christmas party. The angle was perfect, capturing Vanessa approaching Elena with the bucket, Derek's anticipatory smile the moment the water fell, but also the aftermath. The audio was crystal clear, capturing every word of laughter, every cruel comment. The room watched in silence, but Elena paid attention to the reactions around the table. Several board members looked genuinely shocked, but others avoided meeting her eyes, suggesting they'd either been present or heard about the incident already. The video continued, but now it showed the conversation at the bar, Derek's plan to divorce Elena, the discussion of the prenup, but also the revealing comments about strategic planning and the new ownership structure creating opportunities. Cameron's statement about operating in the shadows drew sharp intakes of breath from several people. When the video ended, Elena let the silence stretch, but she noticed Patricia Morrison had gone completely pale. "That video is from last night," Elena said quietly, "but it's not the only thing we need to discuss this morning. Grace, please distribute the financial analysis." Grace placed thick folders in front of each board member, but the Morrison family members received special red folders marked Confidential Legal Review. "Over the past 7 years," Elena continued, her voice steady but hard, "this company has lost approximately $300 million to fraudulent transactions, inflated contracts, and systematic theft. The losses are detailed in those reports, but I can summarize. Someone has been using their positions within this company to enrich themselves at the expense of shareholder value. Since I am now the sole shareholder, they've been stealing from me." Derek shook his head frantically. "Elena, you don't understand how business works. Those transactions were legitimate. Sometimes you have to pay premium prices to secure valuable properties. Sometimes development costs exceed initial estimates. That's just how real estate works." "Is it?" Elena turned to address the full board. "Is it normal business practice to purchase properties from shell companies that trace back to accounts controlled by the purchasing director's family? Is it standard to approve development contracts with firms that share board members with companies owned by your relatives? Is it appropriate for corporate relations to bury harassment complaints against family members while aggressively pursuing cases against non-family employees?" She let each question hang in the air, but the red folders in front of the Morrisons seemed to glow with accusation. "This is ridiculous," Patricia Morrison said, finding her voice. You're making serious accusations based on what? Your hurt feelings from a silly party incident? Derek is right. You don't understand business. You're in over your head and you're lashing out. Actually, said a voice from the door, Ms. Morrison understands business extremely well, certainly well enough to recognize systematic fraud. A man in his 60s entered, but his presence commanded immediate respect. Elena recognized him from Grace's briefings. James Chen, Robert's younger brother and a legendary figure in commercial real estate, but someone who'd been semi-retired for the past decade. Uncle James, Elena said, the word feeling strange but right on her tongue. Niece Elena, James replied with a slight smile. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances, but your father asked me to make myself available if you needed support in your first board meeting. It seems that was wise planning on his part. Derek's face had gone from pale to ashen. Mr. Chen, sir, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Your niece has been fed false information. Be quiet, Mr. Morrison, James said, his voice like ice. I've reviewed every document in those folders. I spent 40 years building businesses alongside my brother, and I know fraud when I see it. The only question now is whether this company handles this matter internally or involves law enforcement. The threat hung in the air, but Elena noticed several board members leaning away from the Morrison family, distance themselves physically as well as professionally. I'd like to offer a third option, Elena said, drawing all eyes back to her, accountability and restitution. Derek leaned forward, hope flickering across his face, but Elena's next words extinguished it immediately. Derek Morrison, you are terminated effective immediately. Your employment contract includes a morality clause that allows for dismissal without severance in cases of conduct damaging to company reputation. I'd say theft and public humiliation of the company owner qualifies. You have 1 hour to clear your office. Elena, please, Derek started, but Elena continued as if he hadn't spoken. Patricia Morrison, Cameron Morrison, Richard Morrison, your employment and consulting contracts are likewise terminated for cause. The evidence of your involvement in fraudulent activities is overwhelming, but I'm offering you a choice. Sign agreements to repay all fraudulent gains with interest over the next 10 years or face criminal prosecution. You have 72 hours to decide. You can't do this, Patricia gasped. We'll sue. We'll fight this. With what money? Elena asked simply. Your assets are mostly tied up in properties purchased with fraudulent gains, and I guarantee you that once I file civil suits to recover company losses, those properties will be frozen. You can certainly fight me, but I have $10 billion to spend on lawyers. How much do you have? The reality of their position seemed to dawn on the Morrison family simultaneously, but their expressions ranged from shock to rage to something that might have been despair. As for you, Vanessa Cole, Elena said, turning to Derek's mistress, you're not employed by this company. You're an external contractor hired as Derek's assistant through his department budget. Your contract is canceled effective immediately, but I'll pay you through the end of the month, professional courtesy. Vanessa's composure finally cracked. You're ruining lives over hurt feelings. So what if Derek was going to leave you? That doesn't give you the right to destroy everyone. You're absolutely correct, Elena agreed. Derek wanting to leave me isn't the issue. Derek laughing while you poured dirty water on me isn't even the issue, though it certainly illuminated character. No, the issue is that Derek and his family have been stealing from this company for 7 years, and you, Ms. Cole, were facilitating it by processing fraudulent contractor approvals through Derek's office. That's in the report, too. Your father's company received $4 million in contracts over the past 2 years, despite consistently failing quality reviews. Those were approved by Derek, processed by you. Vanessa opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Security, Elena called, and 3 uniformed guards entered the boardroom. Please escort the Morrison family and Ms. Cole from the building. They have 1 hour to collect personal effects from their offices. Nothing digital, nothing on paper except items they brought from home. Understood? The guards nodded, but Derek stood frozen, his eyes locked on Elena with an expression she'd never seen before. Complete and utter defeat. "Elena," he whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. If you'd known I had money and power, you would have treated me differently?" Elena finished his sentence. "Yes, Derek, I understand. That's exactly the problem." As security led them out, Derek tried once more to speak, but Elena had already turned away, addressing the remaining board members. "Let me be clear about my expectations going forward," she said, her voice carrying authority she hadn't known she possessed. "This company was built on integrity, but it's been corrupted by people who confused opportunity with entitlement. That ends today. Every contract, every deal, every transaction will be reviewed and audited. Anyone found to have engaged in fraudulent activities will face consequences. But for those of you who've been operating honestly, who've been trying to do right while others were stealing, you have my full support." She paused, letting her words settle, but she could see relief on several faces. "I'm not my father," Elena continued. "I didn't spend 40 years learning this business from the ground up, but I've spent 90 days watching how this company operates, and I've learned something important. The fundamentals are sound, but the culture has become toxic. We're going to fix that, but it starts with accountability." James Chen stepped forward, but his voice carried approval. "Your father would have handled this the same way, perhaps with slightly different words, but the same fundamental approach. Expose the truth, enforce consequences, offer paths forward." Over the next 2 hours, Elena outlined her vision for Northridge Properties, but she also listened to board members share their concerns and perspectives. Several people admitted they'd suspected fraudulent activities but hadn't felt empowered to report them, fearing retaliation from the Morrison family's network of allies. But Elena made it clear that culture would change immediately. "We're installing anonymous reporting systems," she announced. "Anyone who sees unethical behavior can report it without fear of retaliation. And I'm instituting rotation policies. No one will stay in the same department for more than 5 years without review. Comfort breeds complacency, and complacency breeds corruption." By noon, the emergency board meeting had transformed into a strategy session, but Elena felt the energy in the room shift from hostility and confusion to something resembling hope. Not everyone was happy. Several board members had been close to the Morrisons, but everyone understood that change was inevitable. Aftermath. 3 days later, Elena sat in the office that had been her father's, but she'd spent the past 3 days making it her own. The dark wood and leather furniture remained, but she'd added plants, photographs, touches of warmth that suggested the space belonged to someone who valued connection over intimidation. Grace entered with her afternoon coffee, but also with a knowing smile. "The Morrison family's lawyers called. They're taking the restitution deal rather than face prosecution." "Smart choice," Elena replied. "What about Derek specifically?" "He's requesting a meeting with you. Says he has things he wants to say that weren't said at the board meeting." Elena considered this, but she couldn't imagine what Derek thought he could say that would matter now. Still, curiosity won. "Fine, schedule it for tomorrow, here, with you present." The meeting room felt appropriate for the conversation. Neutral ground, professional space, but also territory that belonged entirely to Elena now. Derek arrived 15 minutes early, but security made him wait until the appointed time, a small power play that Elena suspected he noticed but couldn't protest. When he finally entered, Elena was struck by how different he looked, but the change was more than just the absence of expensive suits and confident posture. Derek looked smaller somehow, as if the revelation of her identity had physically diminished him. "Thank you for seeing me," he said quietly, taking the seat across from her. Grace stood by the door, silent witness and protection both. "You have 20 minutes, Elena replied. "What did you want to say?" Derek took a deep breath, but his hands shook slightly as he spoke. "I've spent the past 3 days trying to understand how I became the person you revealed at that board meeting. I keep replaying moments from our marriage, looking for the point where I transformed from someone who loved you into someone who could laugh while water was poured over your head." "And what did you discover?" Elena asked, her tone neutral. "That there wasn't one moment," Derek admitted. "It was gradual, a series of small compromises and justifications. My family's attitude toward you, their constant reminders that you weren't our class, and somewhere along the way, I started believing it, started using it as permission to treat you badly." "Why?" Elena asked. "What did I ever do to deserve that?" Derek met her eyes, but his were wet with tears he didn't try to hide. "Nothing. You did absolutely nothing wrong, Elena. That's what makes this so horrible. You were kind, supportive. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. But I repaid all of that with cruelty because, somewhere deep down, I was angry that you made me feel inadequate." Elena leaned back, but the confession surprised her with its honesty. "Inadequate? You had everything: family, wealth, connections, education, opportunities." "All borrowed," Derek said bitterly. "My family's wealth came from my grandfather, but each generation has diminished it. We look wealthy, but we're actually drowning in debt, maintaining appearances while the foundation crumbles. You came from nothing and built something real. You put yourself through school, worked multiple jobs, never asked anyone for anything. That authenticity, that strength, it terrified me because I knew I didn't have it." "So you decided to destroy it instead," Elena said flatly. "Yes," Derek agreed. "If I couldn't have real strength, I could at least convince myself that yours was worthless. The affair with Vanessa, the public humiliation, all of it was me trying to prove to myself that you were beneath me, when the truth was I'd always been beneath you." Elena studied her ex-husband, but she found she couldn't summon anger or even satisfaction at his confession. Instead, she felt a distant kind of sadness, like watching a tragedy where everyone lost, but no one learned anything until too late. "Is there a point to this confession, Derek?" and asked. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Derek said quickly. "I don't deserve it, and I wouldn't believe you if you offered it. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. I understand what I destroyed, what I threw away, and I'll spend the rest of my life knowing that I had something real, and I crushed it because I was too weak to appreciate it." "The restitution agreement," Elena said. "You're paying back everything, but the payments are structured over 10 years. That's generous considering what you took." Derek nodded. "It's more generous than I deserve. My lawyers couldn't believe you didn't press criminal charges." "Your lawyers don't understand that I'm not interested in revenge," Elena replied. "I'm interested in justice, and there's a difference. Revenge would feel good in the moment but solve nothing. Justice means you face consequences but also have the chance to rebuild your life differently." "Why?" Derek asked. "After everything I did, why give me that chance?" Elena stood and walked to the window, but her reflection showed a woman who'd changed dramatically in just a few days. "Because my father gave me a chance I never expected. He could have revealed himself at any point in my life, but he chose to wait until after his death, trusting that I'd use his legacy wisely. That trust, even after death, meant something. It means I have to pay it forward." She turned back to Derek, but her expression was firm. "That doesn't mean we're reconciled or that I forgive you. It means I'm choosing to be the person my father hoped I'd become, rather than the person your cruelty could have made me. Does that distinction make sense?" "Yes," Derek said quietly. "And Elena, for what it's worth, that woman, the one your father hoped you'd become, she's extraordinary. I'm sorry I never saw it before." After Derek left, Elena sat in silence for several minutes, but Grace finally spoke up. "You handled that with remarkable grace, Ms. Morrison." "Did I?" Elena asked. "Sometimes I worry I'm being weak instead of graceful, that holding people accountable means being harder, crueler." "Your father struggled with that same question," Grace revealed. "He asked me once whether kindness in business was naivety or strength. I told him it was both, naive when dealing with people who'd exploit it, but the ultimate strength when dealing with people who'd respect it. The trick was knowing the difference." "Derek's paying back what he took," Elena said. "His family too. But that humiliation at the Christmas party, how do I pay that back?" Grace smiled. "You already did. You showed up to that board meeting looking every inch the CEO you've become. But you didn't hide what they'd done to you. You made them watch that video, made them own their cruelty in front of peers and colleagues. That's not revenge. That's accountability. And accountability is the foundation of dignity." 6 months later, Northridge Properties had undergone massive transformation in the 6 months since Elena had revealed her identity. But the changes ran deeper than personnel shifts or policy updates. The company's culture had fundamentally evolved from one that rewarded connections over competence to one that valued integrity above all else. Elena stood at the same window where her father had once stood, but she was reviewing financials that showed a remarkable turnaround. The audit had uncovered even more fraudulent transactions than initially suspected, but aggressive recovery efforts had already reclaimed over $100 million. But the real victory was in the future being built rather than the past being corrected. "Ms. Morrison," Grace called from the doorway, "your 3 o'clock is here." Elena turned to see a young woman in her mid-20s, standing nervously in the doorway. But her resume had been impressive enough to warrant a personal interview. Jasmine Torres had graduated from community college with honors, but she'd worked her way through school as a property manager for low-income housing, giving her practical experience that traditional MBA programs couldn't teach. "Ms. Torres," Elena said warmly, "thank you for coming in. Please, sit down." As they discussed Jasmine's vision for affordable housing development, a division Elena was creating within Northridge Properties, Elena saw something of herself in the younger woman's determination and authenticity, but also her uncertainty about whether she belonged in spaces that had traditionally excluded people like her. "Can I ask you something off the record?" Jasmine said hesitantly. "The rumors say you came from nothing, that you used to work as a maid. Is that true?" "Yes," Elena replied simply. "I cleaned houses, catered events, did whatever it took to pay my bills and put myself through community college." "Why do you ask?" "Because everyone says this company's different now, that it values people for their work rather than their connections, but it's hard to believe places like this actually change. I've been disappointed before." Elena understood the hesitation, but she also knew that words alone wouldn't convince someone who'd learned to distrust promises. Instead, she opened her laptop and pulled up the company's new hiring statistics. Increased diversity at every level, promotion rates that correlated with performance rather than tenure, but also employee satisfaction scores that had doubled in 6 months. "Change is real when it's measurable," Elena said, "but it's also real when the person at the top has lived through the same experiences you have. I know what it's like to be dismissed because of where you came from, to be treated as less than because you didn't have the right connections. That's why I'm determined to build something different." Jasmine studied the data, but her expression shifted from skepticism to cautious hope. "If you offer me this position, I promise you won't regret it. I'll work harder than anyone else." "I don't doubt that," Elena replied. "But I also want you to understand that harder than anyone else shouldn't be the standard we apply to people like us. You deserve to work smart and hard, to be challenged and supported, but you don't have to prove your worth by destroying yourself." That lesson took me too long to learn. As Jasmine left, with a job offer and a starting salary that had made her gasp, Elena reflected on how different this conversation was from the ones she'd endured with the Morrison family. But the difference wasn't just in content. It was in the fundamental recognition of shared humanity rather than hierarchical positioning. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "I saw the article in Forbes about your transformation of Northridge Properties. Congratulations on proving that success and integrity aren't mutually exclusive. Derek." Elena stared at the message for a long moment, but she didn't reply. Some conversations were complete, even when the words weren't spoken, but the fact that Derek was paying attention to her success, rather than wallowing in his failure, suggested he might actually be learning from his consequences. Grace appeared with afternoon tea, but also with a knowing smile. "The board wants to know if you'll consider speaking at the National Real Estate Conference next month. They're doing a panel on ethical leadership in corporate America." "They want me to talk about the Morrison situation?" Elena asked. "They want you to talk about transformation," Grace corrected. "How someone can take a position they never expected, in an industry they didn't train for, and still make meaningful change. Your story resonates with people, Ms. Morrison, but not just because of the drama. It resonates because you chose principle over revenge, accountability over cruelty." Elena considered this, but she thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, standing in a ballroom with dirty water soaking through her dress, but holding in her purse the knowledge that would change everything. That woman had been at a crossroads, facing a choice between becoming bitter or becoming better. But she'd chosen a path that honored both justice and mercy. "I'll do the panel," Elena decided, "but I want to be clear about something. I'm not a hero in this story. I'm someone who was given extraordinary circumstances and tried to respond with the values my father hoped I'd have. That's not heroic. It's just human." "Your father would disagree," Grace said softly. "He used to say that choosing humanity in inhuman circumstances was the definition of heroism. He'd be proud of you, Ms. Morrison." Elena looked out at the Denver skyline, but she imagined her father standing in the same spot, watching the city below and dreaming of the company he was building. He'd spent his life in shadows, but he'd given her the chance to step into light, and she'd discovered that light was uncomfortable but necessary, revealing but healing. The dirty water from that Christmas party had long since dried, but its lesson remained. Humiliation could either destroy you or refine you, depending on what you chose to do in its aftermath. The Morrison family had chosen to humiliate her, hoping to break her spirit, but they'd unknowingly given her the perfect opportunity to reveal their true nature along with her own. Derek's laughter still echoed sometimes in her memories, but so did his recent confession, his acknowledgement of the man he'd become and the person he'd destroyed. Elena couldn't forgive him, not yet, perhaps not ever, but she could recognize his attempt at accountability and allow it to exist without requiring her participation. Vanessa Cole had left Denver entirely, but rumors suggested she was rebuilding her career in another city, her father's company having lost its largest contracts but surviving the scandal. Patricia, Cameron, and Richard Morrison had made their restitution payments on schedule, but they'd also been publicly shamed in ways that money couldn't erase. Their social circle had contracted dramatically, but Elena had heard they were focusing on legitimate business ventures now, perhaps finally learning that shortcuts only led to dead ends. As for Elena herself, she'd discovered that inheriting $10 billion was less transformative than inheriting the responsibility that came with it. But the real inheritance had been her father's example of how to wield power without losing humanity. Robert Chen had built an empire, but he'd spent his final act trying to ensure that empire would be guided by someone who understood both privilege and privation, strength and vulnerability. The Christmas party that had seemed like her lowest moment had actually been her liberation, but not because she'd discovered her inheritance. The liberation came from finally seeing clearly, seeing Derek's true nature, his family's corruption, but also seeing her own strength and resilience. The dirty water had washed away illusions, but it had revealed the truth beneath. And truth, Elena had learned, was the foundation of everything that mattered. The Christmas party at Northridge Tower looked similar to the one from a year ago, but the atmosphere was fundamentally different. Elena moved through the crowd, but now she was greeted with genuine respect rather than hidden contempt. Her employees engaging with her as a leader, rather than avoiding her as an embarrassment. Jasmine Torres stood near the windows, but she was explaining the affordable housing project's progress to a group of executives who actually listened and asked thoughtful questions. The division had exceeded all projections, but more importantly, it had proven that profit and social responsibility could coexist when leadership prioritized both. "Ms. Morrison," a voice said behind her, and Elena turned to find James Chen smiling at her. "Your father and I used to make a prediction at every Christmas party. We'd guess which employees would still be with the company in 5 years. Looking around tonight, I think he'd be pleased with the retention rates." "Because we stopped the bleeding?" Elena asked. "Because you built something worth staying for," James corrected. "Compensation matters, benefits matter, but culture matters most. People want to work for organizations that reflect their values, but they also want leaders who've lived through real struggles and came out believing in something bigger than themselves." Elena accepted the compliment, but she also noticed someone standing alone near the bar, Derek Morrison. He'd requested permission to attend through the company's open-door policy for former employees, but Elena had been surprised by her own decision to approve his presence. "Excuse me, Uncle James," she said quietly, making her way through the crowd toward her ex-husband. Derek saw her approaching, but his expression was guarded, careful. He'd aged in the past year, but not necessarily in a bad way. The arrogance had been replaced by something that might have been wisdom earned through loss. "Thank you for letting me attend," Derek said before Elena could speak. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Elena admitted, "but then I realized that excluding you would mean I was still defining myself in opposition to you, still letting our past control my present. That's not who I want to be." Derek nodded slowly. "I've been working with a therapist, trying to understand how I became the person I was. She asked me once what I'd say to you if I had the chance. And I'd say that watching you transform this company, seeing the leader you've become, is both the worst and best thing I experience," Derek said carefully. "Worst because it's a daily reminder of what I destroyed. Best because it gives me hope that people can actually change, can become better than their worst moments." Elena studied him, but she found she could look at Derek now without anger or pain, just a distant kind of sadness for time wasted and potential squandered. "Are you becoming better?" "I'm trying," Derek replied. "I'm working in property management now. Nothing glamorous, just managing small apartment buildings, but I'm learning to do honest work. The restitution payments hurt, but they also remind me every month what theft actually costs. Not just money, but dignity and self-respect." "That's more self-awareness than you showed a year ago," Elena observed. "A year ago I was still making excuses," Derek admitted. "Blaming circumstances, blaming pressure, blaming everything except myself. The truth is I made choices, bad choices, cruel choices, and I own them now." They stood in silence for a moment, but the weight between them had shifted. Lighter somehow, as if acknowledgement had dissolved some of the density that regret and resentment created. "I should go," Derek finally said. "I didn't come to take up your time, just to show respect and acknowledge what you've built here." "Derek," Elena called as he turned to leave, "you asked me once why I gave you a chance at restitution instead of pressing charges. Yes? It's because I learned something important. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And the opposite of cruelty isn't revenge. It's accountability paired with possibility. You're being held accountable, but you also have the possibility of becoming someone different. Don't waste it. Derek's eyes glistened, but he simply nodded and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts and the party continuing around her. Grace appeared at her elbow, but her smile was knowing. "You handled that well." "Did I?" Elena asked. "Sometimes I worry I'm too forgiving." "You're not forgiving," Grace corrected. "You're allowing people to face consequences while also maintaining their humanity. There's a difference. Forgiveness would mean forgetting what happened. You're not forgetting, you're just refusing to let their actions define your character." As midnight approached, Elena found herself standing in almost the same spot where the dirty water had been poured over her head a year ago. But now she stood as CEO, as leader, as someone who'd transformed pain into purpose. The Northridge Tower sparkled with Christmas lights, but the real illumination came from within, from employees who felt valued, from policies that prioritized ethics, from a culture that recognized humanity in everyone. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jasmine. "Just got approved for the next phase of the affordable housing project. Thank you for believing in me." Elena smiled, but she replied simply, "Thank you for believing in yourself. That's the only approval that really matters." The party continued around her, but Elena stepped out onto the balcony, feeling the cold December air against her skin. A year ago she'd been soaking wet from humiliation, but tonight she was simply present, fully herself, fully comfortable with the person she'd become. The dirty water had been meant to shame her, but it had actually baptized her into a new life, washing away the illusions that had kept her trapped in relationships and situations that diminished her worth. Her husband and family had laughed as the mistress poured that water, but their laughter had exposed the bankruptcy of their values and the fragility of their power. They'd thought her inheritance of the 10B real estate company they worked for was impossible, but impossibility only existed for people who couldn't imagine transformation. But Elena had learned that transformation was the only constant. She'd transformed from invisible wife to visible CEO, from victim to leader, from someone who accepted humiliation to someone who demanded accountability. What she'd done had crushed them and made them scream, but not with physical violence or aggressive revenge. She'd crushed them with truth, with consequences, with the mirror of their own actions reflected back at them until they couldn't look away. Their screams had been the sound of ego dying, of comfortable corruption being exposed, of entitlement meeting accountability. But she'd also given them paths forward, opportunities to rebuild their lives differently, and in that mercy she'd found the truest expression of strength her father had hoped she'd possess. The Denver skyline stretched before her, millions of lights representing millions of lives, each one containing stories of triumph and tragedy, justice and injustice, cruelty and kindness. Elena was just one person in that vast landscape, but she'd learned that one person with the courage to demand better could transform not just a company but potentially an entire industry's approach to leadership. The Christmas party continued inside, but Elena stayed on the balcony for a few more minutes, breathing in the cold air and letting it clear her mind. She thought about the hook that had brought her to this moment, unaware she was daughter of a secret trillionaire who had died few months ago, unaware she'd inherited everything, but aware now of who she was and what she stood for. The dirty water was long gone, but its lesson remained. Sometimes the worst moments reveal the best possibilities, and sometimes humiliation is just transformation in disguise. Her husband and family had laughed while his mistress poured that water, but Elena had the last laugh, not cruel laughter, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd faced her worst moment and emerged not broken but refined. The 10B real estate company they'd worked for was now a company they could only read about, but it was also a company that stood as evidence that power could be wielded with integrity. that success didn't require cruelty, and that the best revenge was becoming someone so authentic in their values that revenge became irrelevant. What she'd done had crushed them and made them scream, but she'd also shown them a path forward if they chose to take it. Some had, some hadn't, but their choices were no longer her responsibility. She'd offered accountability and possibility in equal measure, but the rest was up to them. Elena turned back toward the party, but she carried with her the knowledge that she'd survived her worst nightmare and built something beautiful from its ashes. The wife who'd stood frozen in humiliation was gone, but the woman who'd emerged was stronger, wiser, and more committed to living with integrity than ever before. She'd been unaware of so much a year ago, but now she was painfully, gloriously aware of her power, her responsibility, her capacity for both justice and mercy, but also her fundamental humanity that no amount of money or authority could erase. And that awareness, more than any inheritance or title, was the real gift her father had given her. The chance to discover who she was when everything was stripped away, but also the resources to build something meaningful when everything was revealed. The Christmas party sparkled behind her, but Elena Morrison, daughter of Robert Chen, CEO of Northridge Properties, and survivor of her own transformation, stepped back into the warmth, ready to continue the work of building something that would last beyond her lifetime. A legacy not of wealth, but of integrity, not of power, but of humanity, not of revenge, but of justice tempered with mercy. The dirty water had dried, but its lesson was eternal. Sometimes being brought low is the only way to discover how high you can actually rise. 5 years later, the morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Elena's office, but she barely noticed as she reviewed the quarterly reports that showed Northridge Properties had doubled in value since she'd taken control. 5 years had transformed not just the company but the entire industry's conversation around ethical leadership. But Elena had learned that transformation was never finished. It was a continuous process of choosing integrity over convenience. "Ms. Morrison," Grace said from the doorway, but her tone carried unusual excitement. "You have a visitor." She insisted it was important, but she also said you'd want to see her. Elena looked up from her computer, but before she could ask who it was, a woman in her early 30s stepped into the office. It took Elena a moment to recognize her, Vanessa Cole, but transformed in ways that went beyond the conservative business suit and pulled back hair. "Vanessa," Elena said, her voice neutral but not hostile. "This is unexpected." "I know," Vanessa replied, but her hands twisted nervously in front of her. "I almost didn't come. I've started and stopped this visit a dozen times over the past year, but I finally realized that courage isn't about waiting until you're ready. It's about acting despite not being ready." Elena gestured to the chair across from her desk, but she remained standing herself, maintaining the subtle power dynamics that came naturally after 5 years of leadership. "What can I do for you?" "Actually," Vanessa said, settling into the chair, "I came to tell you what you've already done, but you probably don't know about it." Elena waited, but she noticed Grace had remained in the doorway, positioned protectively but discreetly. Vanessa took a deep breath before continuing. 5 years ago, you destroyed my life, or at least that's what I told myself at the time. My father's company lost its contracts. My relationship with Derek fell apart almost immediately after you revealed everything. But I lost my reputation in Denver's business community. I had to leave the city, start over somewhere no one knew me. "I remember," Elena said simply. "I canceled your contract but paid you through the end of the month. Professional courtesy, I called it." "I hated you for that," Vanessa admitted. "The professional courtesy felt like condescension, like you were being magnanimous while destroying me, but I was wrong. I've spent 5 years understanding just how wrong I was." Elena sat down slowly, but her expression remained guarded. "What changed your perspective?" "Everything," Vanessa said. I moved to Phoenix, took a job as an administrative assistant, a significant step down from where I'd been, but it was the only position I could get with my reputation. My new boss was a woman named Michelle Rodriguez, who ran a small property management company, but she had integrity that I'd never encountered in business before. Vanessa paused, gathering her thoughts, but Elena noticed tears forming in the other woman's eyes. Michelle treated me with respect I didn't deserve, but she also held me accountable when I tried to cut corners or use my looks to manipulate situations. One day, about 6 months into working for her, she sat me down and asked me point blank, "Vanessa, who taught you that your value comes from tearing other women down instead of building yourself up?" Elena leaned back in her chair, but she found herself genuinely curious about where this story was leading. "I couldn't answer her," Vanessa continued, "but the question haunted me for weeks. I started therapy, started really examining the person I'd become, but what I discovered was ugly. I'd grown up watching my mother compete with other women for my father's attention and approval, watching her use cruelty as currency in a world where she felt powerless. I learned that playbook and perfected it, but I never questioned whether it was actually effective or just destructive." "And Derek?" Elena asked. "What happened after I revealed everything?" Vanessa's laugh was bitter but honest. "Derek fell apart. The moment you demonstrated real power, he tried to drop me and come crawling back to you, but you weren't interested. Then he tried to keep our relationship going, but it was built entirely on the foundation of his superiority to you. And once that foundation crumbled, there was nothing left. We lasted about 2 weeks before he admitted he'd never actually loved me. I was just a tool to make himself feel powerful." Elena absorbed this information, but she felt a distant kind of validation. Derek's confession a year after the Christmas party had hinted at these truths, but hearing them confirmed by Vanessa added another layer of closure. "Why are you telling me this?" Elena asked gently. "Because I owe you an apology that I've practiced for 5 years but never had the courage to deliver," Vanessa said, her voice cracking. "Elena, I poured dirty water on you at that Christmas party. I humiliated you in front of dozens of people, but I did it with joy, with satisfaction, with the belief that I was somehow winning by destroying you. I've spent 5 years understanding that I wasn't winning anything. I was just revealing how broken I was inside." Tears flowed freely now, but Vanessa didn't try to hide them. "You had every right to press charges, to sue me, to destroy me completely, but instead you canceled my contract and paid me through the month. That professional courtesy you showed, the thing I interpreted as condescension, was actually grace I didn't deserve. But it gave me enough financial runway to get to Phoenix and start over." Elena felt something shift in her chest, but it wasn't quite forgiveness. It was more like understanding. "You're apologizing now, 5 years later. What took so long?" "Shame," Vanessa said simply, "and the understanding that an apology delivered before you've actually changed is just manipulation wearing a polite mask. I needed to become someone different before I could apologize for who I was, but I also needed to understand that you might not accept my apology, and that would be okay too." Elena stood and walked to the window, but she looked out at the Denver skyline that had witnessed so much transformation over the past 5 years. "What are you doing now? Professionally, I mean." "I'm a licensed therapist," Vanessa replied, and Elena turned in surprise. "I went back to school, got my master's in counseling psychology, but I specialize in working with women who use relational aggression and competition as coping mechanisms. I help them understand what I learned, that tearing other women down doesn't actually build you up. It just surrounds you with rubble." Elena returned to her desk, but she studied Vanessa with new eyes. "That's impressive. Genuinely impressive." "It's penance," Vanessa corrected, "but it's also purpose. Every woman I help understand that collaboration is stronger than competition, That integrity outlasts manipulation. Every woman I help becomes proof that people can actually change. But change requires facing the ugliest parts of yourself without flinching. They sat in silence for a moment, but Elena felt the weight of the past 5 years settling between them, not oppressively, but like snow that had finally melted to reveal the ground beneath. "I accept your apology," Elena finally said, and Vanessa's sharp intake of breath was audible. "But I want you to understand what I'm accepting. I'm not saying what you did was okay, but I'm not saying you're forever defined by it either. You did something cruel, you faced consequences, but you also did the harder work of actually changing. That deserves acknowledgement." Vanessa wiped her eyes, but her smile was genuine for the first time Elena could remember. "Thank you. That means more than you can possibly know." "There's something else," Elena said, making a decision that surprised even herself. "Northridge Properties has been developing employee wellness programs, but we're missing expertise in the kind of psychological work you're describing. Would you be interested in consulting for us? Coming in quarterly to run workshops on healthy workplace dynamics, competition versus collaboration, that kind of thing." Vanessa's shock was evident. "You want to hire me? After everything?" "I want to hire the person you've become," Elena corrected. "The person you were 5 years ago couldn't do this work authentically, but the person sitting in front of me now has lived experience that could help our employees navigate difficult dynamics. And honestly, having someone who can speak to transformation from personal experience is more valuable than someone who's only studied it academically." 3 months later, Elena stood at the back of the conference room, but she watched Vanessa lead a workshop on redefining professional success beyond competition and comparison with quiet satisfaction. 50 Northridge employees filled the room, but their engagement was evident in the questions they asked and the vulnerability they showed. "I spent years believing that another woman's success diminished my own," Vanessa was saying, "but that's scarcity thinking, the belief that there's only so much success to go around, so we have to fight for our share. The truth is that success breeds success, but collaboration compounds it in ways competition never can." A young woman raised her hand. "But what if you work in an environment where people are actively undermining you, where collaboration isn't reciprocated?" Vanessa nodded, but her answer came from hard-won wisdom. "That's the hardest scenario, and I won't pretend there's an easy answer. But I've learned that you can't control other people's behavior. You can only control whether you compromise your integrity in response to theirs. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is maintain your values even when others abandon theirs. But you also have to be willing to walk away from toxic environments when staying means sacrificing who you are." Elena saw several people nodding, but she also noticed the workshop had drawn attention from senior leadership. Her CFO, Rachel Kim, a brilliant executive Elena had promoted based on merit rather than connections, stood near the front, but her expression suggested she was processing personal relevance in Vanessa's words. After the workshop ended, Rachel approached Elena with unusual hesitancy. "Ms. Morrison, do you have a moment?" They stepped into Elena's office, but Rachel's normally confident demeanor seemed shaken. "That workshop brought up some things I've been avoiding confronting, but I think I need to tell you something." Elena gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing herself, sensing Rachel needed to feel less trapped for this conversation. "When you first promoted me to CFO 3 years ago," Rachel began, "several of my male colleagues told me I'd only gotten the position because you were on some feminist crusade, that my qualifications didn't actually matter. I told myself I didn't believe them, but some part of me internalized it." "How so?" Elena asked gently. "I've been working twice as hard as necessary, staying late every night, checking everything 3 times because I was terrified of making a mistake that would prove them right," Rachel admitted. "But Vanessa's comment about scarcity thinking hit me. I've been operating from a belief that my success was borrowed, that I had to constantly prove I deserved it, but that belief has been destroying my health and my relationships. Elena sat down across from Rachel, but her voice carried firm compassion. You're one of the best CFOs in the industry. The fact that some insecure men tried to undermine your confidence says everything about them but nothing about your qualifications. Have I ever given you reason to doubt that I promoted you based on merit? No, Rachel said quietly. You've been nothing but supportive. But I realize now that I didn't need your validation. I needed to validate myself, but I didn't know how. Are you asking for help with that? Elena asked. Rachel nodded. I think I need to work with Vanessa individually. I need to understand why I'm still seeking approval from people whose opinions shouldn't matter, but I also need to figure out how to stop running from imaginary inadequacy. Elena made a decision quickly. Done. I'll have Grace connect you with Vanessa, but I'm also going to say something as your boss that I hope you'll hear as truth. Your work is exceptional, your judgment is sound, but your value as a human being exists completely independent of your professional achievements. If you never closed another financial report, you'd still deserve respect and dignity. Does that distinction make sense? Rachel's eyes welled up, but she nodded. It does, but hearing it and believing it are different things. That's what therapy is for, Elena said with a small smile, learning to close the gap between what you know intellectually and what you believe emotionally. 6 months later, Elena reviewed the employee satisfaction surveys with growing satisfaction, but the data told a story beyond just numbers. Employee retention had increased, productivity metrics had improved, but perhaps most tellingly, reports of workplace conflict had decreased, while reports of collaborative problem-solving had increased dramatically. Vanessa's quarterly workshops had become so popular that Elena had expanded them to monthly sessions, but she'd also created a small stipend fund for employees who wanted to pursue individual therapy. The program had been controversial with some board members who saw it as unnecessary expense, but the ROI data had been undeniable. Healthier employees were more engaged, more creative, but also more loyal. Ms. Morrison, Grace said, appearing with her afternoon tea, but also with an unusual expression. Derek Morrison is in the lobby. He doesn't have an appointment, but he's asking if you have 15 minutes. Elena felt a familiar tension in her shoulders, but 5 years of transformation had taught her that avoiding discomfort only prolonged it. Send him up, but stay close. Derek entered looking healthier than Elena had seen him in years, but the change went beyond physical health. He carried himself with a quietness that suggested hard-won humility rather than defeated resignation. Thank you for seeing me without an appointment, Derek said, remaining standing until Elena gestured to a chair. I know your time is valuable. What brings you here, Derek? Elena asked, her tone neutral but not hostile. I heard Vanessa's been working with your company, Derek said, running workshops, consulting on workplace dynamics. I wanted you to know that I think that's remarkable, both that you hired her and that she transformed herself enough to be worth hiring. Elena studied him carefully. Is there a point beyond observation? Derek took a deep breath. I'm getting remarried next month. Her name is Angela. She's a high school teacher, but she's also someone who challenges me to be better rather than enabling me to be worse. I wanted to tell you personally before you heard through the grapevine. Congratulations, Elena said, and she was surprised to find she meant it. I hope you've learned enough to treat her better than you treated me. So do I, Derek agreed, but I'm also realistic enough to know that transformation isn't a straight line. I still catch myself falling into old patterns, the entitlement, the belief that shortcuts are smart rather than destructive. But Angela calls me on it immediately. She won't tolerate the person I was, but she's willing to support the person I'm trying to become. Elena appreciated his honesty, But she also noticed how different this Derek was from the man who'd laughed while dirty water was poured over her head. What changed between the person you were and the person you're trying to become? Derek considered the question carefully. I think the fundamental shift was understanding that my value as a human being can't come from comparing myself to others, not feeling superior to you, not feeling inferior to my family's legacy, not measuring myself against some imagined standard of success. My value has to come from my integrity, my choices, but also my willingness to face consequences without making excuses. That's a hard-won lesson, Elena observed. The hardest, Derek agreed. And honestly, I'm not sure I would have learned it if you'd let me off easy. The restitution payments hurt. They're still hurting. I've got 5 more years of them. But that pain is what keeps me honest. Every month when I make that payment, I'm reminded of what theft actually costs. But I'm also reminded that I'm choosing to pay my debt rather than run from it. They sat in silence for a moment, but Elena felt the strange closure that came from seeing someone actually change rather than just promise to change. I should go, Derek said, standing. But Elena, thank you. Thank you for holding me accountable, but also giving me a path forward. Thank you for being stronger than I ever was, but also kinder than I deserved. And thank you for showing me what integrity actually looks like in practice, rather than just in theory. After Derek left, Elena sat alone in her office, but she found herself reflecting on the past 5 years with a depth she usually avoided. The Christmas party where dirty water had been poured over her head had seemed like the worst moment of her life, but it had actually been the catalyst for becoming the person she was always meant to be. Her husband and family had laughed while his mistress humiliated her, but they'd unknowingly participated in their own destruction by revealing their true nature at the exact moment Elena had the power to respond. What she'd done had crushed them and made them scream, but she'd also given them tools to rebuild themselves differently if they chose to use them. Some had. Derek was paying his restitution and apparently building a healthier relationship. Vanessa had transformed herself completely, turning her worst impulses into a career helping others avoid her mistakes. But the Morrison family had taken different paths. Patricia and Richard had completed their restitution payments, but had moved to Florida, starting a small property management company that operated honestly but without the glamour they'd once enjoyed. Cameron had struggled more, bouncing between jobs, but last Elena had heard, he was working as a contractor doing actual manual labor, a come-down from his executive position, but perhaps a necessary humility lesson. Elena pulled up her father's letter, the one that had started everything, but she read it with 5 years of experience now informing her understanding. Use it wisely. Use it to become the person I never had the courage to be. Show the world what a Chen can do when they choose light over shadows. She'd spent 5 years interpreting that letter, but she understood now that her father hadn't been asking her to be perfect. He'd been asking her to be authentic, to choose transparency over secrecy, accountability over enabling, but also mercy over vengeance. The light he'd asked her to choose wasn't about exposure for its own sake, but about creating clarity where confusion and corruption had thrived. The final board meeting of the year. Elena stood before the Northridge Properties Board, but the composition had changed dramatically since that first emergency meeting 5 years ago. New faces filled most seats, people promoted based on merit, recruited for integrity, but united by a shared commitment to ethical business practices that went beyond legal compliance to actual moral leadership. 5 years ago, Elena began, I stood in this room and revealed both my identity and the systematic corruption that had been bleeding this company for years. Today, I want to share where we've gone since then, but also where we're going next. She pulled up a slide showing the company's growth trajectory, but the numbers told a remarkable story. Northridge Properties had doubled in value, but they'd also tripled their affordable housing investments, quintupled their employee satisfaction scores, but completely eliminated the toxic workplace dynamics that had once defined the culture. These numbers represent more than financial success, Elena continued. They represent proof that integrity and profitability aren't opposites. They're partners. Every dollar we've made has been earned ethically. Every relationship we've built has been based on mutual respect, but we've also demonstrated that holding people accountable doesn't require cruelty, and offering second chances doesn't mean enabling continued bad behavior. James Chen, still on the board, but in a reduced advisory capacity as he approached full retirement, spoke up with a smile in his voice. Your father would be proud, Elena, but I think he'd also be slightly jealous. He spent 40 years building this company, but you've transformed it in 5. The difference is that he worked in shadows and you've insisted on light. Uncomfortable sometimes, but ultimately healthier. I had an advantage he didn't, Elena replied. I started from nothing, so I understood what it felt like to be dismissed, underestimated, treated as less than. That experience informed every decision I've made as CEO, but it's also why I've been so committed to creating opportunities for people regardless of their background. Rachel Kim, the CFO who'd struggled with imposter syndrome but had grown into one of the company's strongest leaders, added her perspective. Ms. Morrison, your leadership style has been transformative. For many of us who came from non-traditional backgrounds, you've created a culture where our differences are assets rather than liabilities. But you've also shown us that vulnerability and strength aren't opposites. They're actually inseparable. Elena felt emotion rising in her throat, but she pushed through. Which brings me to the next phase of Northridge's evolution. We're launching the Chen Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to providing business education and startup capital for people from foster care, low-income backgrounds, but particularly for women who've faced systematic barriers to opportunity. She clicked to the next slide, showing the foundation's structure and funding mechanism. The foundation will be funded by dedicating 5% of Northridge's annual profits in perpetuity, but it will also accept outside donations and grants. The goal is to create pathways for people like I was, people with potential but without access, people with dreams but without capital, people with integrity but without connections. The board erupted in spontaneous applause, but Elena noticed several people had tears in their eyes. This was the culmination of 5 years of transformation, not just fixing what was broken, but building something new that would outlast her tenure and potentially change entire industries by changing who had access to them. My father gave me an inheritance I never expected, Elena concluded, but the real inheritance wasn't the money or the company. It was the responsibility to use both wisely. I hope the Chen Foundation represents that wisdom, but I also hope it represents the kind of legacy that creates more leaders who've experienced both struggle and success, because those are the leaders who understand that power is a responsibility rather than a privilege. That evening, Elena stood on the same balcony where she'd stood 5 years ago after the Christmas party that had changed everything. But tonight the air was warm with early summer rather than cold with December chill. The Denver skyline sparkled below her, but she saw it differently now. Not as a landscape of power and wealth, but as a collection of lives and stories, each one containing the possibility of transformation. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jasmine Torres, who'd been promoted to Vice President of Affordable Housing Development. Just saw the Chen Foundation announcement. Boss, you're changing lives before they even know they need changing. That's real power. Elena smiled, but she replied simply, we're changing lives together. That's the only power that matters. Grace appeared with a glass of wine, but her expression carried satisfaction rather than just professionalism. 5 years ago, you asked me what your father would have done in your position. Do you remember my answer? You said he would have let the evidence speak for itself, Elena recalled. I was wrong, Grace admitted. Your father would have gathered the evidence, but he might not have had the courage to reveal it publicly the way you did. He spent his life avoiding conflict, managing from shadows, but you've demonstrated that the healthiest approach is often the most direct. Expose the truth, enforce the consequences, but offer paths forward for those willing to change. Elena sipped her wine, but she thought about all the people who'd been part of this 5-year journey. Derek rebuilding his life with apparent sincerity. Vanessa transforming her worst impulses into purposeful work. Rachel learning to value herself independent of external validation. Jasmine building a career based on merit rather than connections. But countless other employees who'd found in Northridge Properties a workplace that actually aligned with their values. Do you think people really change, Grace? Elena asked. Or do circumstances just reveal who they always were? Grace considered the question carefully. I think both can be true. Circumstances reveal character, but character isn't fixed. It's something we build through choices, especially choices made when no one's watching. Derek was cruel to you, but his choices since suggest he's building different character now. Vanessa humiliated you, but her choices since suggest she's become someone who helps rather than harms. That's real change, not just circumstantial revelation. And me? Elena asked. Have I changed, or did inheriting $10 billion just reveal who I always was? You've changed, Grace said firmly. 5 years ago, even with all your integrity and strength, you would have accepted that humiliation and stayed in that marriage because you believed you didn't deserve better. Today you know your worth isn't dependent on anyone else's recognition. It's intrinsic, unshakable. That's transformation, Elena, not revelation. They stood in comfortable silence, but Elena felt the weight of the past 5 years settling into something like peace. The dirty water had long since dried, but its lesson remained fresh. Sometimes the worst moments reveal the best possibilities, but only if we have the courage to step into the light those moments create. Her husband and family had laughed while his mistress poured that water, unaware she'd inherited the 10B real estate company they worked for, but their unawareness had been a gift in disguise. It had allowed Elena to see clearly, to observe without the distortion of premature disclosure, but it had also given her time to decide who she wanted to be when the truth was finally revealed. What she'd done had crushed them and made them scream, but 5 years later, some of them were thanking her for it, because crushing their comfortable corruption had created space for uncomfortable growth. Their screams had been pain, but sometimes pain was the signal that change was happening, that old patterns were breaking, but new possibilities were emerging. Elena thought about the hook that had started this story, all those words about unawareness and humiliation, about inheritance and revenge. But she understood now that the real story had never been about any of those things. The real story was about a woman who'd been raised in shadows, finally stepping into light and discovering that light was both revealing and healing, painful and transformative, but ultimately necessary for becoming fully herself. The Christmas party 5 years ago had seemed like an ending, but it had actually been a beginning, not just of her tenure as CEO, but of her journey toward authentic leadership that valued people over profit while demonstrating that the two weren't mutually exclusive. The dirty water had been meant to humiliate her, but it had actually baptized her into a new life, washing away illusions but revealing truth. And truth, Elena had learned over 5 years of transformation, was the foundation of everything that mattered: relationships, businesses, legacies, but most importantly, the person you became when you finally stopped pretending and started being. The Denver skyline continued sparkling below her, but Elena no longer saw it as a landscape she'd conquered. Instead, she saw it as a community she was privileged to serve, a city full of people who deserved leaders willing to choose integrity over convenience, transparency over secrecy, but also mercy over vengeance. Her father had asked her to show the world what a Chen could do when they chose light over shadows. But Elena had discovered that the light wasn't about exposure, it was about illumination. Exposing wrongdoing mattered, but illuminating better paths forward mattered more. Her father had understood this intellectually, but Elena had learned it experientially. But that difference made all the difference. As she turned to go back inside, Elena caught her reflection in the glass door, but the woman looking back was someone her younger self would barely recognize. Confident without being arrogant, powerful without being cruel, but most importantly, fully herself without apology or explanation. The dirty water had dried long ago, but its transformation remained, turning humiliation into purpose, pain into wisdom, but betrayal into clarity. Her husband and family had laughed. His mistress had poured that water, but none of them had understood what they were actually doing. They were revealing themselves completely while simultaneously baptizing Elena into the person she was always meant to become. 5 years later, Elena understood that the best revenge wasn't crushing them or making them scream, though she'd done both initially, but instead became someone so authentically powerful that revenge became irrelevant. She'd built something meaningful, transformed countless lives, but created a legacy that would extend far beyond her lifetime through the Chen Foundation and the culture she'd established at Northridge Properties. That was the real victory, not winning a battle against people who'd wronged her, but winning the war for her own soul, choosing to become someone defined by her values rather than shaped by others' cruelty. And as Elena Morrison stepped back into the warmth of her office, leaving the balcony and its memories behind, she carried with her the fundamental truth that had taken 5 years to fully understand. Sometimes the dirty water is exactly what you need to wash away everything that isn't authentic, leaving behind only the person you were always meant to be. The inheritance of $10 billion had changed her circumstances, but the inheritance of self-knowledge had changed her life. And in the end, that made all the difference.